Welcome back to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? I'm Jeanette Sakel. In this episode, I'm looking at the other side of the coin, namely language attrition. When I lived in Denmark and spoke Danish daily, my German was suffering because I didn't speak it very much. Things that had been very natural became slightly rugged, slightly more difficult. And this was particularly upsetting to my parents, since German was my mother tongue, and they must have felt that they were truly losing me. Usually, though, I would not confuse the languages when addressing people, but there was one moment when I was speaking to my mum about a Danish friend. It was a very difficult topic, and that required me to think quite carefully about how best to phrase it so that I wouldn't offend my mum. I was quite happy with the arrangements in my head, and spoke out, only for my mum to look at me slightly puzzled. I had been speaking Danish, which my mum doesn't speak. So while I was concentrating on what to say, I had subconsciously reverted to my default language, which at the time was Danish. This sometimes happened to me as well in other settings, such as when teaching in England, in English. When I was giving examples in other languages, I sometimes really struggled to revert back into English. And I sometimes reverted to the wrong language when going back to the lecture. In one very spectacular case, I was speaking German for a few sentences before I noticed. I was speaking German to my daughter a lot at the time, so this became the natural language I was speaking to explain things. So what is it with this default? It's obviously the language that is dominant in the head at that particular time. And that can change from 1 hour to the next. That can change from one day to the next, or it can take longer to change. But other than this outright switching that I've just discussed, are there any other ways in which we can tell? The answer is yes, and this is really interesting because the way our brains retain information, the way our brains change what is going on, is quite interesting. Our brains are not static, and neither are the languages that we speak. I realized this because there were only ever so many languages I could have going at any one time. Some languages would have to give, and sometimes the structures of the languages that were giving were changing. This obviously depends greatly on the situation and on the individual, so just like with second language acquisition, when it comes to losing a second language, there are a lot of different factors involved. As an example, when I moved back to Germany for my PhD studies, I was speaking Danish daily. But I was also speaking my native language, German, more often now because now I was living in Germany. And then at my research institute, a Max Planck Institute where I was doing my PhD, we were all speaking English. So those were the 3 languages I was speaking daily. At that time, I had just finished my MA, and I had written my MA thesis on a grammatical structure in Kalaallisut, in Greenlandic, and I had been to Greenland, to Sisimiut, to do fieldwork there on the language. I had also studied Finnish quite intensively. I had a BA in Finnish from my Danish university together with a degree in linguistics, and I was using Finnish a lot at that time. I was elated when I received funding to do my PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, and my funding was awarded on the basis of writing a grammar of a language. And at that point it was not quite clear where that language would be spoken. But after some discussions, talking to various different people, it was decided that I would be working on the language Moseten from Bolivia. I realized that speakers of Moseten all spoke Spanish, so I had to learn Spanish, or at least improve my Spanish, to be able to work in Bolivia. I wanted to improve my Spanish to a pretty high standard as well. So I embarked on learning Spanish every day. And at the time, well, the way at the time you would do this was by using a book and a CD with an audio track. I could have joined the course, but I didn't have that much time to prepare for my first fieldwork trip. I also learned as much Moseten as I could at the time. Well, there wasn't a lot written about the language, so there wasn't a lot to learn. I subsequently started working in Bolivia, and I was using Spanish daily. And I was also learning and then eventually speaking Moseten. And this was the main focus of my PhD thesis, so this was the language I was working on very intensively. These 2 languages, Spanish and Moseten, were my main focus during my time in Bolivia, But I was also speaking Danish with my partner back then, usually via email. I would use English to write my thesis and communicate with my colleagues back home. And I would also speak some German. I encountered a number of German students and expats in La Paz, and we would sometimes go out and just hang out. That didn't happen very often because I was working most of the time. But in principle, I had these 5 languages in my daily life: Mosothen, Spanish, English, Danish, and German. And I juggled these languages more or less successfully. When it came to speaking Finnish, however, I started to struggle. It seemed as if every word that I was learning in Spanish was taking over a word in Finnish. And when, about a year into my PhD, I went to a conference in Finland, I found that when I tried to speak Finnish, all that was coming out of my mouth was Spanish, with the occasional Finnish word thrown in. How strange. I realized at the time that juggling those 5 languages daily was about my limit, and I could just not have any other languages join these. I think since then I have revised my views slightly, because if there had been a situation where I would have used Finnish in Bolivia, where I would have had the need to speak Finnish, then surely I would have retained Finnish as well. So it's only ever about having a number of languages active at any one time, but then also having the need to speak these. If you don't have the need, and if you don't speak them, then it's much more likely that the language will disappear slowly. Later, something very similar happened with other languages. So, for example, when I was learning Portuguese, that took over my Spanish, even though my Spanish was also positively influenced by Portuguese, as I discussed in the previous episode. But now that I was learning Chinese, Chinese was taking over a number of languages too, just as expected. And simply because I was immersing myself in Chinese so much, I was not always paying as much attention to the other languages that I knew, and I didn't really have the chance to speak them. So when an email arrived from a Bolivian academic suggesting a small collaboration, and this email was written in Spanish, I was very keen, but I realized that my Spanish was holding me back. I kept wanting to write in Chinese. I wanted to reply to his email in Chinese, and it was a real effort to get back to him in Spanish. When I talk about an effort here, it's not like I had to relearn Spanish from scratch. Far from it. I could understand pretty much everything that he was saying. I didn't need a dictionary. It was just my production of Spanish, so my spoken and my written Spanish that had really gone downhill because I hadn't used the language. I could obviously, at that point, have brushed up my Spanish very quickly. So a week or 2 of watching Spanish movies, starting to speak, maybe writing and reading in the language, that would probably have been a big step towards regaining some of that proficiency that I had seemingly lost. So the language can go down, it can also go up. This is how language just works in our brain. But when the language goes downhill, this is what we're calling attrition. And attrition of a language can look quite different from person to person. There's obviously attrition of a first language, so you can lose your mother tongue, but this is much rarer. This could be the case for me speaking German in an English environment. If I wasn't speaking German daily, my German would go downhill. And there are a few features, obviously, in my German that we can call attrited speech, so that we can call, like, having undergone language attrition. Second language attrition, then, is losing a language that you have learned later in life. And the longer you have learned the language, the less likely are you to lose a lot of it. It's also the higher proficiency you have, the better are you going to be at retaining that language. But bits of it are still going downhill. First language attrition and second language attrition look quite similar when it comes to attrited speech. So the speech of people who have undergone language attrition in some way. What does that look like? Well, it may come across as talking more hesitantly and slowly, for example, using loads of pauses, and so on. There may be repetitions of words or self-corrections when the speaker realizes that what they're saying is not quite right. And sometimes people may need to switch into another language because they don't quite know the word, or they may ask for help in the situations. They may ask, what is this called again? We can also see this in the frequency of grammatical items and lexical items. So speakers who show attrition usually have more high-frequency words, so they would use words like do and make instead of more specific words such as scratch or undergo. They may avoid very complex constructions as well, so they may use more simple sentence structures. Language attrition can be placed on a scale, and we can look at our language proficiency as a marker on that scale, and this marker can move up or down depending on where we are, how fluent we speak at any one time, and that depends very much on our own circumstances. So, which factors affect language attrition? It's actually very, very similar to the factors that affect language acquisition that we discussed in one of the very early episodes in this podcast series. It has to do with input and output of the language. It has to do with attitudes and identity. It has something to do with how long you've learned the language, and where you're living, and what your overall situation is like. So this could mean, for example, how much are you using the language interactively? So how much are you communicating with others? Are you only ever interacting with yourself or reading newspapers or the like? Or are you actually using the language to speak? Also, what is your inner language? Do you think or dream in that language? Do you sometimes use that language in this way? Attrition can appear in a lot of different places. We talked about the general way of expressing oneself already, where your speech may become slower, there may be loads of pauses and the like. The sounds you're using, your accent may be strange. Your lexicon may be strange. You may be using very frequent words and overall come across as slightly simpler in your language use. And this can just be a perception. I mean, we linguists, we have ways of measuring this lexical diversity, but to a general speaker, it wouldn't really be noticeable other than, they're not using very advanced language when they're speaking. And then similarly, grammar can become simplified. So some expressions may not be readily available to speakers undergoing attrition, and then these speakers have to revert to high-frequency items. And when grammatical structures change, again, this can mean that irregular past tenses such as left can be rephrased as leaved. Okay, so where you just put an ed at the end of something to make it past tense and leave out the irregular form. Often the speaking is affected much earlier than the understanding, and obviously the writing as well with respect to the reading. So while we're still able to understand and read, and this is the case for me with Spanish, producing the language may be much more difficult. Though I have to say that Finnish is also becoming more difficult for me to understand. So sometimes when reading social media posts, I revert to the automatic translation and then catch myself in the act and realize that I shouldn't really do that in order to maintain my Finnish. But it's been 25 years or so since I last actively used the language, so no wonder I'm no longer really able to use it. We can look at the way attrition works, and very, very simply put, it follows a very similar path to acquisition, just the other way around. So the things, the structures, the words that take the longest to acquire are very often the ones that are lost the earliest. It's not quite as simple as that. There are obviously a lot of other factors that play a role, but this is still interesting. Overall, though, the less proficient you are in a language, the easier it is to lose it again. Also, if you have very negative attitudes towards the language, you're more likely to lose it again than if you have very positive attitudes towards the language. I've retained my Danish pretty well, despite having less exposure to it. But I've got really positive attitudes towards the language. I love the language. And I'm seeking exposure to Danish as much as I possibly can. So I'm collaborating with Danish universities, for example, as an external examiner. And I like to speak Danish with the very few people I know near to me who speak Danish. So I try to engage in speaking Danish whenever I can. And I've noticed that even with Danish, which I spoke to a very high proficiency, I sometimes don't quite know the gender of a noun. These are usually nouns that are not very common, not very frequent. Sometimes I struggle with this. But, well, I didn't struggle with this when I lived in Denmark and was exposed to the language every day. And as I speak Danish more, I soon pick up these constructions again and these genders of specific nouns and so on. It's just getting used to the language again and getting it going. So in the light of this, the question, how many languages do you speak is actually really tricky. Because, well, what are we going to say? Do we say that during my lifetime I've learned a lot of languages, but I've forgotten a lot of languages as well? We could potentially list the highest proficiency we have once had in the language. And for those people who like to take language tests, this is a way to do this. They can take a language test when they've reached a certain proficiency, and then they have the certificate to show that they spoke the language at this level. I don't tend to do that. But what I could do is, for example, list all the languages that I have known at intermediate level, say B1 level at one point. This list would be considerably longer than a list of the languages I currently speak at B1 level or above. So it is really a question of what we include in this particular instance. Now you may ask, is it still worth learning a language when that language is going to go downhill anyway when you don't speak it? I guess this is a good question, but in my opinion, it's worth learning any new skill. You will lose it after a while if you're not practicing it, but is it really getting lost? Well, our brains are not computers, and sadly we can't retain all information that we have once learned, but we learn new knowledge. This changes our outlook on life, on the world. It changes our approaches to things, and we change as a person. This change can be quite subtle, but this new knowledge will have an influence on the way we act and the way we understand the world. So it's not just about the retaining of the knowledge itself, but also those changes to ourselves that I find really important. Crucially though, that knowledge that you have learned still tends to be there somewhere, and it can be tapped into. And just like with the languages I've not spoken for many years, I could learn them again pretty quickly. Obviously, those languages I spoke to a very high level previously, I will probably learn more quickly than those that I didn't speak very well, where I would still have a lot of learning to do, but I would definitely not have to start from scratch.